Ego and Archetype, part 12. Alright, so we finish with that big paragraph from Jung. It's talking about the psyche being an autonomous factor. And we kind of relate to it through religious symbolism, right? So we'll continue. So yeah, we finished the quote, so we'll continue with Edinger. As with all matters pertaining to personality, the concretistic and reductive fallacies will not be changed by rational exhortation. Actually, they can be considered as two successive stages in personality development. The state of identification between ego and unconscious symbols gives rise to the concretistic fallacy. This state is characteristic of an early stage of ego development, seen, for instance, in primitives and children. The reductive fallacy stemmed from a state of alienation between the ego and symbolism of the unconscious. It seems to be a later stage of development, perhaps a necessary reaction against the previous state of identity between ego and unconscious. At this point, ego development may require a depreciation of the unconscious and of the power of its symbolic images. However, this leaves a dissociation between ego and unconscious, which sooner or later must be bridged if one is to become whole. So I'll read the last paragraph again. At this point, ego development may require a depreciation of the unconscious and of the power of its symbolic images. However, this leaves a dissociation between ego and unconscious, which sooner or later must be bridged if one is to become whole. The ultimate goal of Jungian psychotherapy is to make the symbolic process conscious. To become conscious of symbols, we first need to know how a symbol behaves when it is unconscious. All the inhuman practices of savage rites and rituals, as well as neurotic symptoms and perversions, can be understood if we realize how a symbol functions unconsciously. The basic proposition is this: an unconscious symbol is lived but not perceived. The dynamism of the unconscious symbol is experienced only as a wish or an urgency towards some external action. The image behind the urgency is not seen. No purely psychological meaning is discerned behind the motivating force of the symbolic image, which has one in its grip. The ego, identified with the symbolic image, becomes its victim. The ego, identified with the symbolic image, becomes its victim, condemned to live out concretely the meaning of the symbol rather than to understand it consciously. Oh, man. To the degree that the ego is identified with the archetypal psyche, the dynamism of the symbol will be seen and experienced only as an urge to lust or power. This explains the distinction between the depth psychology of Jung and all other psychological theories. Only Jung and his school so far have been able to recognize the symbol and therefore the archetypal psyche, of which it is a manifestation, as it functions when the ego is not identified with it. In Freudian psychology, for instance, where Jung sees the transpersonal archetypal psyche, Freud sees the id. The id is a sorry, I can't say that one. The id is a caricature of the human soul. The archetypal psyche and its symbols are seen only by the way they manifest themselves when the ego is identified with them. The id is the unconscious seen only as instinct, with no consideration of the images that lie behind the instincts. To the extent that the images are dealt with at all, they are reductively interpreted back to the instinct. The symbolic image, per se, is granted no substantive reality. This Freudian attitude toward the unconscious is important to understand because it is shared in one form or another by practically all the schools of modern psychotherapy. No psychiatrist will deny that the urgencies of the instincts are alive and effective, but they almost all join in denying the life and reality of symbolic images in and for themselves. This widespread attitude of modern psychology, which sees the unconscious psyche as motivated only by the instincts, is basically anti-spiritual, anti-cultural, and destructive of the symbolic life. To the extent that such an attitude is held, the cultivation of a meaningful inner life is impossible. Instinctive compulsions do, of course, exist in abundance, but it is the symbolic image acting as releaser and transformer of psychic energy, which lifts the instinctive urgency to another level of meaning and humanizes, spiritualizes, and acculturates the raw animal energy. Oh man, it acculturates the raw animal energy. The instinct contains its own hidden meaning, which is revealed only by perceiving the image that lies embedded in the instinct. One way of discovering the hidden image is by the process of analogy. As Jung says, the creation of analogies frees instinct and the biological sphere as a whole from the pressure of unconscious contents. Absence of symbolism, however, overloads the sphere of instinct. As an example of the analogical method, I recall a patient who was in the unconscious grip of a powerful symbolic image which required him to live it out as a symptom until he could understand it consciously. Oh, man. I'm feeling the weight, increase, like every sentence. Sorry. Required him to live it out as a symptom until he could understand it consciously. Since it is easier to see large things than small ones, I choose an example that is magnified to speak by the fact that it is a symptom of psychopathology. I am thinking of a case of transvestism. A young man who had a strong urge to dress in woman's clothes. When wearing some piece of feminine clothing, his attitude toward himself underwent a radical change. Ordinarily, he felt shy, inferior, and impotent. But when wearing some article of feminine apparel which could be hidden from general view, he felt confident, effective, and sexually potent. Now, what does such a symptom mean? This patient was living out an unconscious symbolic image. Since such symptom images have the same origin as dreams, we can approach them in the way we would a dream, by the method of amplification. We then ask ourselves, what about dressing in women's clothes? What general and mythological parallels can we find? In Book 5 of the Odyssey, Odysseus' journey between Calypso's isle and the land of the Phaeacians is described. During the journey, Poseidon stirs... I'm probably saying that wrong. Poseidon stirs up a frightful storm, which would have drowned Odysseus, except that Ino, a sea goddess, comes... It's the names get me, the mythological characters. During this journey, Poseidon stirs up a frightful storm which would have drowned Odysseus, except that Ino, a sea goddess, comes to his assistance. She tells him to take off his clothes and swim for it, and adds, "Here, take my veil and put it around your chest. It is enchanted, and you can come to no harm so long as you wear it. As soon as you touch land, take it off. Throw it back as far as you can into the sea." Ino's veil is the archetypal image that lies behind the symptom of transvesticism. Ino's veil is the archetypal image that lies behind the symptoms of transvesticism. The veil represents the support and containment which the mother archetype can provide the ego during a dangerous activation of the unconscious. Sorry. I don't know if I should edit these out. I'm trying to read it smoothly without reacting, but it's provoking. The veil represents the support and containment which the mother archetype can provide the ego during a dangerous activation of the unconscious. It is legitimate to use this support, as Odysseus does, during a time of crisis. But the veil must be returned to the goddess as soon as the crisis is over. Another parallel is provided by the priests of the Magna Mater in ancient Rome and Asia Minor. After their consecration, these priests would wear feminine dress and allow their hair to grow long to represent their commitment to the service of the Great Mother. A remnant of this sacerdotal transvesticism exists today in the skirts worn by the Catholic clergy who are in the service of Mother Church. These parallels go to show that the urge of the transvestite is based on the unconscious need for a supporting contact with feminine deity, the mother archetype. This is the way to understand such a symptom symbolically. Of course, whenever we speak of the image of a deity. We are using a symbol because a deity or suprapersonal power cannot be precisely defined. It is not a sign for something known and rationally understood, but rather a symbol expressing a mystery. This manner of interpretation, if successful, can lead the patient toward the symbolic life. A paralyzing, guilt-laden symptom can be replaced by a meaningful, life-enriching symbol, which is experienced consciously rather than lived out in an unconscious, compulsive, symptomatic way. This case is an example of how a symptom can be transformed into a symbol through awareness of its archetypal foundations. Every symptom derives from the image of some archetypal situation. For instance, many anxiety symptoms have as their archetypal context the hero's fight with the dragon, or perhaps the rites of initiation. Many symptoms of frustration or resentment are a reenactment of Job's archetypal encounter with God. To be able to recognize the archetype, to see the symbolic image behind the symptom, immediately transforms the experience. It may be just as painful, but now it has meaning. Instead of isolating the sufferer from his fellow humans, it unites him with them in a deeper rapport. Now he feels himself a participating partner in the collective human enterprise. The painful evolution of human consciousness, which began in the darkness of the primordial swamp and which will end we know not where. Intense moods are emotional states. Intense moods and emotional states will also yield up their meaning if the relevant symbolic image can be found. For example, a man in the grip of an angry mood. Things were not as he wished, but he couldn't neither act out the effect nor repress it. Finally, he prayed for understanding of its meaning. Immediately, the image came to him of the three men in the fiery furnace as described in the book of Daniel. He read this passage in the Bible, and as he reflected on it, his mood disappeared. The third chapter of Daniel describes the decree of Nebuchadnezzar that all people on signal shall fall down and worship his golden idol. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused, and Nebuchadnezzar, in a state of rage, had them thrown into the fiery furnace. But they remained unharmed, and a fourth figure was seen walking with them in the fire, like a son of God. This image resolved the angry mood because it expresses symbolically the meaning of the mood. King Nebuchadnezzar represents an arbitrary, tyrannical, power-driven figure who would usurp the prerogatives of God and rages when he is not treated as deity. He is the ego identified with the self. His rage is synonymous with the fiery furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, by declining to give transpersonal value to a personal motivation, expose themselves willingly to the fire of Nebuchadnezzar's frustration. This would correspond to the patient's ability to avoid identification with Sorry. This would correspond to the patient's ability to avoid identification with the effect, but instead endure it and finally seek its meaning in active imagination. The fourth figure that appears in the furnace, like the Son of God, would represent the transpersonal archetypal component that was actualized in the experience. It brings meaning, release, and wholeness. That's the fourth. This example illustrates a statement of Jung about his confrontation with the unconscious. He writes, This example illustrates a statement of Jung. About his confrontation with the unconscious, he writes, I was living in a constant state of tension, to the extent that I managed to translate the emotions into images. That is to say, to find the images which were concealed in the emotions. I was inwardly calm and reassured. To find the images which were concealed in the emotions. So he translated the emotions into images. End of quote. To the extent that one is unaware of the symbolic dimension of existence, one experiences the vicissitudes of life as symptoms. Symptoms are disturbing states of mind which we are unable to control and which are essentially meaningless. That is, contain no value or significance. Symptoms, in fact, are degraded symbols, degraded by the reductive fallacy of the ego. Symptoms are intolerable precisely because they are meaningless. Almost any difficulty can be borne. Almost any difficulty can be borne if we... So born is B-O-R-N-E. I'm not sure if that's the same thing. If we can discern its meaning. It is meaninglessness which is the greatest threat to humanity. Our waking life is composed of a series of moods, feelings, ideas, and urgencies. These successive psychic states through which we pass are like beads strung on a single string. Depending on our conscious attitude, we experience this rosary of life either as a succession of meaningless symptoms or through symbolic awareness as a series of numinous encounters between the ego and the transpersonal psyche. Our pleasures as well as our pains are symptoms. Our pleasures as well as our pains are symptoms if they carry no symbolic import. The sages of India recognize this in their doctrine of Maya. According to this view, pain and pleasure, which are symptoms of life, are indissolubly connected. To gain release from the painful symptoms, one must also relinquish the pleasurable symptoms. In terms of analytical psychology, the Indian's striving for release from the urgencies of pain and pleasure is equivalent to the search for the symbolic life. Nirvana is not an escape from the reality of life. It is rather the discovery of the symbolic life which releases man from this awful, grinding, banal life, which is only a succession of meaningless symptoms. Part 3, the symbolic life. The symbolic life in some form is a prerequisite for psychic health. Without it, the ego is alienated from its suprapersonal source and falls victim to a kind of cosmic anxiety. Dreams often attempt to heal the alienated ego by conveying to it some sense of its origin. Dreams often attempt to heal the alienated ego by conveying to it some sense of its origin. Here is an example of such a dream. The dreamer was struggling with the problem of ego self-alienation. She was a prey to profound feelings of depression, unworthiness, and the meaninglessness of her life and capacities. Then she had this dream. An old man who was both a priest and a rabbi was talking to me. As I listened to his words, I was deeply moved and felt I was being healed. It seemed as though God spoke through him. I felt the eternal question, which is always within me, resolve itself. For a moment I knew why. As he talked, he put me back in touch with something I had known a long time ago, before I was born. End of the quote. This dream had a powerful impact on the dreamer. She experienced it as something healing. The eternal question concerning the meaning of her life was answered. But what was the answer? At first, upon awakening, she could not remember what the old man had said. Then suddenly she thought of an old Jewish legend she had once read in a book, and she realized that it was the essence of this legend which the priest rabbi had been telling her. The story of this legend is as follows. Prior to the birth of a child, God calls the seed of the future human being before him and decides what its soul shall become, man or woman, sage or simpleton, rich or poor. Only one thing he leaves undecided, namely whether he shall be righteous or unrighteous. For as it is written, all things are in the hand of the Lord except the fear of the Lord. The soul, however, pleads with God not to be sent from the life beyond this world. But God makes answer. The world to which I send thee is better than the world in which thou wast. And when I formed thee for this earthly fate. Thereupon God orders the angel in charge of the souls living in the beyond to initiate this soul into all the mysteries of that other world, through paradise and hell. In such manner, the soul experiences all the secrets of the beyond. At the moment of birth, however, when the soul comes to earth, the angel extinguishes the light of knowledge burning above it, and the soul, enclosed in its earthly envelope, enters this world, having forgotten its lofty wisdom, but always seeking to regain it. That's the end of the quote. We'll finish the dream. The dream which brought this beautiful legend to the dreamer's mind is an excellent example of the operation of the ego self-axis, which brings into consciousness and awareness of the ego's origin and meaning and awakens the symbolic life. The figure of the old man, the rabbi priest, is a representation of what Jung has called the archetype of the old wise man. He is a spiritual guide, bringer of wisdom and healing. I would consider him to be a personification of the ego self-axis. In the combination of priest and rabbi, he unites two separate religious and symbolic traditions, although the tale he has to tell does not belong to any particular religious system. The theme of the prenatal origins of the ego is an archetypal image of which we can find many examples. For instance, there is Plato's doctrine of prenatal ideas as elaborated in the Phaedo. According to this myth, all learning is a recollection of prenatal knowledge, which is innate but forgotten. In psychological terms, this means that the archetypal forms of human experience are pre-existent, or a priori. I hate this word. Priori. They only await incarnation within a particular individual life history. This Platonic theory of reminiscence is sometimes expressly stated in dreams. A person may dream of being involved in a significant happening which he dimly realizes has happened before and is following some predetermined plan. As one dreamer described such a dream, it was as though I was experiencing the dream on two levels simultaneously. On the one hand, it was unique, spontaneous, and unrehearsed. On the other hand, I seemed also to be playing a role and reenacting a story I had once known but forgotten. The two levels were inextricably connected. I was playing the role perfectly just because I was really living it at the same time. I made up my lines as I went along, but I seemed to be helped by the fact that I had once known the story. When each situation came up, it struck some chord of memory which came to my assistance. End of quote. Another parallel is an old Gnostic tale which has many similarities to the Jewish legend previously quoted, but carries it a step further by showing how the soul awakens and remembers its heavenly origin. Modern translators have entitled this text "The Hymn of the Pearl." I quote it, somewhat abridged, from Hans Jonas's book. Quote, "When I was a little child and dwelt in the kingdom of my father's house and delighted in the wealth and splendor of those who raised me, my parents sent me forth from the east, our homeland, with provisions for the journey. They took off from me the robe of glory which in their love they had made for me, and my purple mantle that was woven to conform exactly to my figure, and made a covenant with me, and wrote it in my heart that I might not forget it. When thou goest down into Egypt and bringest the one pearl which lies in the middle of the sea, which is encircled by the snorting serpent, thou shalt put on again thy robe of glory, and thy mantle over it, and with thy brother, our next in rank, be heir to our kingdom. I left the east and took my way downwards, accompanied by two royal envoys. Since the way was dangerous and hard, I was young for such a journey. I went down into Egypt, and my companions parted from me. I went straightway to the serpent and settled down close by his inn until he should slumber and sleep, so that I might take the pearl from him. I was a stranger to my fellow dwellers in the inn. I clothed myself in their garments, lest they suspect me as one coming from without to take the pearl and arouse the serpent against me. But through some cause they marked that I was not their countryman, and they ingratiated. I've never seen this word. And they ingratiated, and they ingratiated themselves with me and mixed me, drink, with their cunning, and gave me to taste of their meat. And I forgot that I was a king's son and served their king. I forgot the pearl for which my parents had sent me. Through the heaviness of their nourishment, I sank into deep slumber. All this that befell me, my parents marked, and they were grieved for me. And they wrote a letter to me, and each of the great ones signed it with his name. from thy father, the King of kings, and from thy mother, mistress of the east, and from thy brother, our next in rank, unto thee, our son in Egypt, greeting. Awake and rise up out of thy sleep, and perceive the words of our letter. Remember that thou art a king's son. Behold, whom thou hast served in bondage. Be mindful of the pearl, for whose sake thou hast departed into Egypt. Remember thy robe of glory. Recall thy splendid mantle, that thou mayest put them on, and deck thyself with them, and thy name be read in the book of the heroes, and then become with thy brother, our deputy, heir in our kingdom. Like a messenger was the letter. It rose up in the form of an eagle, the king of all winged fowl, and flew until it alighted beside me and became holy speech. At its voice and sound I woke and arose from my sleep, took it up, kissed it, broke its seal, and read, just as was written on my heart were the words of my letter to read. I remembered that I was a son of kings, and that my free-born soul desired its own kind. I remembered the pearl for which I had been sent down to Egypt, and I began to enchant the terrible and snorting serpent. I charmed it to sleep by naming over it my father's name. The name of our next in rank, and that of my mother, the Queen of the East. I seized the pearl and turned to repair home to my father. Their filthy and impure garment I put off, and left it behind in their land, and directed my way that I might come to the light of our homeland, the East. My letter, which had awakened me, I found before me on my way. And as it had awakened me with its voice, so it guided me with its light that shone before me. And with its voice, it encouraged my fear. And with its love, it drew me on. Then, as he approached his homeland, his parents sent out to him his robe of glory and his mantle. And I stretched toward it and took it and decked myself with the beauty of its colors. And I cast the royal mantle about my entire self, clothed therein. I ascended to the gate of salutation and adoration. I bowed my head and adored the splendor of my Father, who had sent it to me, whose commands I had fulfilled, as he too had done what he promised. He received me joyfully, and I was with him in his kingdom.